Welcome to the ViniMark podcast, a collection of interviews with thought leaders of the wine world, brought to you by ViniMark.
We looked at the top 10 Chenin Blanc winners over the last 10 years, and what we saw was those sites had similar growing season temperature, similar summer rainfall, and fairly similar solar radiation. And that combination can be used to identify new areas for Chenin Blanc production. When you look at South Africa, and then again even further into the Western Cape, our climate scenario is seasonal variability. The annual amount of rainfall is not actually changing in a lot of areas. It's how the rainfall is being received. Climate change is unfortunately a reality, but becoming a desert is not what I foresee in the near future.
That was the voice of Dr. Tara Southey, who is the CEO and founder of Terraclim. Now, in today's podcast, we are discussing the very exciting cutting edge of viticulture in the Cape Winelands. Now, Tara's company, Terraclim, is one of the big movers and shakers in the industry that is aiding our more progressive vinerals in their fight against increasingly erratic weather conditions induced by climate change. Terraclim also provides valuable climate predictions that will help farmers to operate far more efficiently as they make decisions around the future of the South African winelands. Tara, thank you so much for making time to chat to us today.
Thank you, Jono. It's a real pleasure to be here and a great opportunity to talk to you all.
Terraclim has been making waves amid especially the more progressive viticulturists in South Africa. But from my understanding, the founding idea behind Terraclim goes far broader than just wine. Am I right?
Absolutely, Jono. Terraclim started trying to solve problems in the South African wine industry, one of them being climate change, and a big factor was inaccessibility to weather station data and terrain data, which are two fundamental inputs that drive every biological system. And we realize more and more that it is needed in every agricultural commodity and sector. So we are spreading our wings from the Western Cape into South Africa and hopefully globally in the next few years to serve agriculture with climate data.
A lot of the discussion around climate change seems to revolve around how accurately we've been able to predict data from the past and whether the weather stations that have existed in the past have given us an accurate feel. So how have you managed to change all that at Terraclim?
I did my PhD looking at the impact of climate change on the wine industry. And the big focus for us was to identify what are the environmental factors driving grapevine responses. Because when you start looking at the impact of climate change, you start looking at crop and animal responses. So through that 6-year study, we looked at the grapevine over a climate band from Vredendal, which is a very hot area on the upper parts of the Western Cape near the coast, very highly dependent on water use, all the way down to Elgin, which is one of our cooler climate scenarios. And throughout that study, it was very clear that climatic factors such as hourly temperatures in specific months start impacting the physiology of the grapevine to either flower earlier or flower later, which then pulls through to our harvest time being earlier or later. And we started to identify that it's the threshold of hourly temperatures are changing in the context of climate change. A lot of the industry was still looking at daily maximums and monthly maximum and minimums, and that really doesn't say anything because it summarizes a whole lot of extremities. So my studies have really highlighted the need to start looking at hourly temperature data, not daily and monthly. And then it was important to start identifying where are our weather stations located. And what we started to see in our analysis was that each region was responding differently to climate change. So you have one area, Breedekloof, Robertson, where they're getting increases in maximum temperatures, but decreases in minimum temperatures, slight shifts in rainfall patterns. And that area today is starting to have more and more frost incidences as a result of the minimum temperatures decreasing. Then you get other areas like Cape South Coast responded differently to areas such as Paarl and Stellenbosch. So it is very interesting that not all the wine producing regions should be responding the same to climate change. Each has a different weakness, for lack of a better word, where they need to strengthen their practices to adapt. We really saw a need in the research space to start aggregating data into a centralized environment and ingest as many weather station points as we could. And then we did start looking at, can we start incorporating remote sensing to supplement weather station networks? So we take weather station points and we interpolate that and we create hourly temperature services, which we can then complement with remote sensing data. So instead of having one weather station on your farm, you now have a map of temperature on your farm. It correlates with elevation, distance to coast, slope aspects, some places solar radiation. So then you can start seeing what does my hours above 35 profile look like across my farm, contextualize that within your ward, then within your district, then within your region, then within your country. A big factor in all our analysis was not just using forecasting models and forecasting that in 2050, X and Y is going to happen, but it is looking what's happened in the past 10 years, 20 years to start quantifying what is your climate vulnerability in the Breeder Kloof or in Elgin or in the Swartlands.
Okay, so historically, maybe a farmer would have had one weather station on his farm, whereas you are now building these highly complex, multi-layered maps with various metrics. Is that correct?
Essentially, Terraclim creates millions of little virtual stations on your farm. So every 40 meters, you put a new temperature value, and that is of much greater value than a satellite image because it's available every hour. And then that hourly data gets aggregated to thresholds. So hours above 35, hours below 7, hours between 25 and 30, which is optimal photosynthetic windows for vines. So you can start figuring out what is driving certain viticultural outcomes. And if I can give you an example, 2018 in October, we had extreme temperature fluctuations. So we had a 20-degree difference between maximum and minimum over a few days in 2 weeks within October. And that temperature fluctuation puts a plant or an animal in a state of freeze because it's an extreme stress. So then cell division didn't happen in some areas or cell expansion didn't happen in other areas based on how far the developmental phase was in the plant. So some areas have smaller berries and other areas have less berries. And that pulled all the way through to the harvest. That resulted in some areas in the wine industry having significantly lower harvests. So that's where Terraclim data becomes extremely valuable, where you wouldn't have been able to make that correlation using just a few weather stations and satellite images.
But Terraclim is taking sometimes rather abstract data points and bringing it down to something as granular as predicting how a single vine might respond given the symptoms you're seeing in the weather system now.
It's not about having the highest resolution, and that meaning 1 meter by 1 meter temperature map or a 1 meter by 1 meter soil grid, which is the mindset that we've all sat with for a very long time. Data integration is the most valuable insight for the future. So you're not just looking at temperature, but you're also looking at water, you're looking at soil, you're saying clay percentage, soil depth, solar radiation aspect, all these variables coming together. And if you look at only solar radiation in a specific area, but if you've got high temperatures and high solar radiation, you're going to have a high amount of heat stress. But if you've got high solar radiation and low temperatures, you end up having an opportunity where there's more solar radiation, but the plant's not going to go into a state of heat stress because the temperatures are slightly lower. So it's starting to understand the integration of variables. If we can start to aggregate that information into an environmental profile, that's where we start getting answers. So we ran a study at one point where we asked some of the best consultants in the industry, what are the variables that you look at when you plant Cabernet Sauvignon? Everybody had different weightings on different variables. So some had a higher priority on soil, others slope, others solar radiation. So then we spun it back and we said, okay, let's map where Cabernet Sauvignon was planted. Then let's look at the economic profile within that and the quality profile within that. And that's where we developed the Terraclim suitability tool for the South African wine industry, which can be extended to every crop type. You can now select a profile. You've got all the Cabernet Sauvignon fields and you're a consultant and you know these 5 are my top producing cabs and you want to know why. You select them, you create a profile, and then you can look at what are the commonalities across 44 environmental parameters, looking at soil, terrain, climate, that are driving that style and why is it doing better. And it's been interesting that there are similarities. What we're starting to see in the context of climate change, if we look at the climate stripes globally, we're progressively getting hotter as a globe. Climate stripes Africa, we are progressively getting hotter as a unit. But then when you look at South Africa and then again even further into the Western Cape, our climate scenario is seasonal variability. We're still getting slightly cooler years that come out in amidst the extreme hot years. So we are sitting with seasonal variability. And if you look at something like rainfall, our data is starting to able to aggregate what is the shift, the amount of rainfall days that you have and when those rainfall events happen. The annual amount of rainfall is not actually changing in a lot of areas. It's how the rainfall is being received. And then it comes down to a management structure of what are you doing to change the capturing of that water. So we're getting more extreme events of extreme rain that's resulting in flooding. We've had a few incidences in the South African wine industry, which has been scary and caused a lot of damage. But in light of all of that, it's how do you aggregate data with the most detail to start quantifying what's actually happening within your environmental profile. so that you can start making different decisions. And that's where these 44 environmental parameters all stacked on top of one another is really innovative and is changing the way that we look at how we do agriculture. We did an analysis with the Chenin Blanc Association where we looked at the top 10 Chenin Blanc winners over the last 10 years. And we averaged the top 10 winners. And what we saw was out of all 44 environmental parameters, those sites had similar growing season temperature, similar summer rainfall, and fairly similar solar radiation. And that combination can be used to identify new areas for Chenin Blanc production. So the aim is really, and I think in all agricultural sectors, is to premiumize your production. How do you plant something in an area that it can actually thrive? And we're working with plants. Plants are highly adaptable, but you've got to give them an environment with enough plasticity that they can shift either way.
You mentioned a controversial topic, which is a conversation between what has the greatest effect, terroir in the traditional definition versus the biome. So it's only been in the last 10 years that terroir has almost been forced to acknowledge the biome around it and the plants that grow in the area. When you look at the 44 parameters, for something like Cabernet Sauvignon, what is making more of a difference, soil types or the circumstances in which those vines are situated?
There's a big drive at the moment talking about biomes. You've got the biodiversity and you've got ESGs, environmental social governance structures. I've had a lot of collaborations with WWF, conversations around how do you not just look at climate, terrain, and soil, but when do you start pulling in the natural wetlands, natural corridors? And there are a lot of viticulturists in South Africa that are really doing phenomenal work through bringing in those biomes of natural fynbos, natural vegetation, natural forages in the area, and playing with the contours, playing with the solar radiation and different things. And that is the way, in my opinion, for the future. And climate change is unfortunately a reality because of the carbon emissions throughout the world. But becoming a desert is not what I foresee in the near future because farmers are innovators, farmers are survivors. It is unfortunate that the adaptation to diversifying crop types, adaptation to thinking differently isn't where I believe that it should be. And it's difficult to just shift a mindset to say, I'm actually going to go plant kiwis or I'm going to continue with wine and I'm going to change my marketing strategy. So there's a big drive throughout terroir and throughout like biomes and biodiversity, trying to understand how do you use that to premiumize an industry and a structure into an international playing field. And for me, South Africa is uniquely positioned for that. We've got a phenomenal sea breeze effect that other countries don't have that blows inland midday every day. And when you've worked in the vineyards for many years doing your stem water potentials at midday and it's hot and by 3:00, you just get the sea breeze effect that comes through and just cools down everything. It gives our agriculture a little bit of breathing space. And I think your question about what is the most important variable to look at, it's managing exactly what you said, that biome of what is your soil, what is your water use within your environments? Have you got your whole environment as your farm? So it's not just looking at a vineyard on your farm, it's looking at your whole entire farm and then getting the farmers within that community to start talking to one another because you've got one world and one water source and it's a system. But you need to know what is your climate vulnerability. In some areas are highly vulnerable between the months of September and October because of the fluctuations in maximum and minimum temperatures. Other areas are starting to get summer rainfall, which they've never had before. So it's about how do we adapt? Whenever I stand on stage and I do these climate change talks, I always ask myself, but so what? This is what we're working with. This is the canvas that we have to paint on now. What would I do differently? And I'd get right back into my soil. I'd get right back into my water. I'd get right back into the ecosystem of how my farm operates and breathes as a unit.
There's a business that was developed here in Cape Town that is able to use satellite imagery in order to detect and predict the growth of certain types of algae in water bodies. I wondered if you guys are seeing technological advances that enable the recognition or prediction of certain types of microbes or fungi in the soil that can help farmers to understand what is going on in their soil, or are we still a little way away from that sort of insight?
No, there's a lot of research going on in that space. South Africa has definitely been ahead in the conversations of how do we become regenerative. I was at a macadamia nut conference last year, September, and there was all this talk about how do we become more biodynamic and diverse. And there's a company called Sporotech that's spun out of Stellenbosch University that measure your microbes in your soil, and it provides you with an indicator. And then you keep measuring that, and you start getting in a biodiversity score. that you can feed into the ESGs, carbon sequestration, all of that. But it's starting to understand how do you manage that ecosystem, because it takes different management practices to get it right. From an official implementation point of view, we're not 100% there yet. And it's been frustrating. You sit in a lot of conversations and we want to measure the microbial environment in soil, and we haven't had the local laboratories to actually analyze that. Samples have to be sent off to different countries, but that's definitely advancing and changing through entities like Spirotech.
Have you seen a drastic change in Terraclim's capabilities as a result of the integration of AI applications?
I feel like it can be a massive competitive advantage if you know how to use it and you know how to build a product around it. But at the end of the day, irrespective of where you apply AI, it comes back down to what is your data input. So we need to still have a physical weather station in the field collecting the data, and to ensure that is sound through the collection process before we can put it in and you can start doing modeling on that. If you start looking at yield as an example, to do yield predictions, the best way to do it is to base it on a significant amount of backbone data where someone has physically collected that information and it's verified. So we as a South African wine industry are on the point now where through Service wanting to digitize the whole of the South African wine industry and to start identifying what should be planted where. And that's also where a lot of AI modeling can help us. But I still come down to if you feed it garbage, you're going to get garbage out.
For us wine nerds, the really exciting prospect is being able to look at a region that we've never thought of to grow wine in your 44 parameters, all of a sudden say, oh my goodness, this would be amazing for Gamay Noir. And all of a sudden, South Africa produces the world's best Gamay because we've unlocked the secret, right? But in order to get that to happen, it feels like you guys are experiencing 3 bottlenecks, right? The first is actual data points from real sensors. Then to get all that data, your next bottleneck is the ability to process that amount of data, even just the physical computing capabilities. And the third bottleneck would be then the actual extraction of meaningful conclusions or predictions from that data. So if we look at those 3, which bottleneck is slowing you down the most?
I think, like you said, AI and technology are so advanced at the moment that the data processing, the data integration, and getting the analytics to come with outcomes, that's not really the bottlenecks. The biggest bottleneck is mindset shifts to start collaborating and sharing data. Because data has all of a sudden become such a valuable asset, it's also resulted in people becoming extremely tight-fisted and saying, no, my data is a commodity. I'm not going to share my data. But you can only get answers out of systems like AI and out of all the new technologies through data integration. So it's really trying to cross those barriers within one specific commodity, say South Africa wine, to get all of the sectors like IPW and Vita and Service, to get all of those entities to work together, get everybody around the table to understand what does it mean to share your data? Like, how do you really understand the expression of a specific area and what makes that area unique, whether it's a rich biome or whether it's minerality or whether it's climate? What is the driver that gives that sector a unique story? But for me, that's a bottleneck. And the other bottleneck, I think, for me is trying to put data in the hands of the farmer and get the farmer to start helping develop the tools. One of the biggest mandates of Terraclim pivoted on a survey that we did with researchers, consultants, and farmers to identify what is the need in the context of climate change. And the holistic voice was access to climate and terrain information to make more informed decisions. And that drove the South Africa wine to drive the flagship project for the last 6 years, which now spun out into Terraclim as a commercial product, which we are working with South Africa wine to still provide additional solutions and services, but driven by the grower's voice. And we've recently inherited a farm in the Karoo, and now looking at how tight it is and the small profit that a farmer makes, you think 5 times before you want to invest in technology. And farmers have invested in so much technology over the last few years with the robotics and the drones and the satellites. How much of it's truly needed and how much of it's actually of value in your decision making? And I spoke to a farmer before this call, and he also just, again, said we've lost sight of the little things that we need to measure. He gave me a story of an old farmer. He's an old dairy farmer, but his literage is always higher than any of the farmers in the surrounding areas. So this one farmer went to him and said, why do you always get more literage than I do? So he said to this techie farmer, I shake a matchbox in the ears of my cows every night and they produce more milk. And then this guy was like, what? So he went and did that. And he came back and he said, my milk is increasing. How does this work? And he said, it's the fact that you were in your dairy. There was feet on the ground in your management practice. And that resulted to you're fixing problems, seeing things, speaking to your staff differently. And for me, there was such a good analogy of we can't just zoom out and have technology farm for us. We have to come back down to seeing day to day how things operate, because the value and the insights lie with the farmer. So I think developing technology in the hand of the farmer is really hard. And that is a massive bottleneck because things are really slow. We push out a web app and then it doesn't function well. It takes too much time. It doesn't have this feature. And then you go back to the drawing board and redevelop. But there's so much value in that for us as a company.
I'm comforted to hear that farmers are investing in technology in South Africa. Is your gut feel that the South African farming community is fairly tech savvy compared to the rest of the world?
I can't compare to the rest of the world, but we are definitely aligned with technology. There's still some older ways of thinking. And I think the key is to bring the older way of thinking as key inputs into your technology development, because there are insights there that no amount of technology and AI could ever develop. But if we look at what Israel has done, it's all linked to innovation. And the only limitation that will drive us to a desert is if you don't adapt. And we're looking at a scenario where crop types that we never thought would be an option are now options. And I think it becomes really important to different commodity heads throughout South Africa, whether it's potato SA or SA wine, to start communicating with growers that you should be planting this cultivar here and this clone here through research and development. And that's where I think what Terraclim's building through the data integration becomes an extremely valuable asset that can inform that decision making. If data does the talking and that can provide you with insights that you should be planting kiwis instead of grapes or grapes instead of apples, we can start becoming more sustainable for the future. That excites me because if we can start understanding this, you can start giving insights to Africa, to all the uncultivated land that we sit with. And the scenario of 60% of uncultivated land lies in Africa, and that's going to feed the world in the future. It gives me goosebumps every time I think about it. If we can start identifying where kiwis work, where lychees work, where grapes work, you can start giving insights to those areas to say, actually, here's a crop suitability. You should plant maize and this clone of maize on this specific day using satellites and remote sensing, which provides you with moisture indexing and carbon indexing. So it's just the aggregation of information.
You talked about some grape farmers might have to plant kiwis, but are there regions in South Africa where you predict citrus farmers may find themselves very excited to plant grapes and make incredible wine, or perhaps, heaven forbid, avo farmers up north find themselves planting grapevines instead and produce incredible wine of origin, Limpopo Cabernet Sauvignon?
Absolutely. And that's what excites me about aggregating the data so we can start understanding what is an optimal Cabernet Sauvignon profile for yield and what is one for high quality. And we're working with a company that's currently doing that. They're looking at where can they take their current profile of a specific wine like Chenin Blanc and where can they recreate that profile throughout the whole of South Africa. So we've got the technology and the capabilities to do that. And you see these random profiles popping up the coast and George and Plett and different areas that you wouldn't have expected. And there's a lot of innovations also in planting at different altitudes. There's a few farmers planting Shiraz at 1,250 meters above sea level. It's made phenomenal wine. So there is innovations happening and we're seeing areas throughout the Cape South Coast, which has been predicted, opening up for wine and not just Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, cool climate wines, but also starting to bring in other cultivars into those areas. I think the biggest pivot for us as a South African industry is starting to understand what works where and not having the old school mindset of you need to have a whole wine range under your estate brand. Maybe you should just be known for Sauvignon Blanc. We ran a suitability study on a specific site, and the analysis through the suitability said that farm should only be planting Sauvignon Blanc. And that farm fits into all the literature that's been published of what makes optimal Sauvignon Blanc. It faces False Bay. It gets an amazing sea breeze effect. It's the correct aspect, the perfect soil type, and all of that. And it's now the farmer's choice. Does he only want to plant Sauvignon Blanc? Does he want to put marketing behind it and develop a brand that can be renowned globally, which is possible? So it's getting to a place that growers can potentially start bidding for the highest price for a specific site, which has been vetted by an entity like Terraclim to say this is the right typicity linked to this environmental profile that can provide this wine over multiple years. And this is our climate change scenario. And also start using those data sets to get further investments.
In South Africa, we've got a problem where grape prices are embarrassingly low. And that's why our national vineyard is shrinking so much. I love the idea of a sort of Terraclim. This is a Terraclim AAA plus Sauvignon vineyard or site, or this is a Terraclim platinum level Pinot Noir vineyard site, etc. It's an interesting little idea because the consumer loves shiny things, and there's no reason why a diverse wineland like the Cape Winelands shouldn't have hierarchies of sites which are based on solid data produced by your company, Terraclim. I just wanted to ask you one last question for the wine geeks. We've got a term, climate change cultivars, which we use a lot around the office to discuss the grapes that South Africans will be forced to drink in the decades to come. Given that you are helping to assess and analyze certain sites, often to plant new cultivars. And I just wondered if there were 2 or 3 grapes or cultivar names that keep popping up in conversations that wine lovers and grape hunters should start to look out for more and more.
When I start looking at all the futuristic cultivars that have been proposed as this is our climate change solution, I think most of the industry still comes back to our basics and what are the core cultivars actually. And there's also a project running within Vinpro, which is one of the consultancy units in the South African wine industry. They have a project called Gen Z. And they've gone out and they've planted different rootstocks and different cultivars on different rootstocks, looking at what is the affinity between the two, and then also what is the suitability in different climatic environments. And it was really interesting to physically see what do the different rootstocks look like and how do they respond. And rootstocks is really important to us in the South African context, and linking the rootstock to a specific scion to get a specific typicity and style and nature of growth is really important. But Chenin Blanc comes up a lot because there's so many different winemaking processes that can be aligned with that cultivar. And then its adaptability to very dire climatic conditions where water is more scarce, the conditions are harsher, and you can have the bush vine structure that protects the grapes. That is very exciting. There's been a lot of conversations about Grenache, but that's very much linked to solar radiation sites. We haven't really explored that. Shiraz is a very adaptable cultivar, and that's one of the ones that they planted at 1,250 meters above sea level. And then Chardonnay is very unexplored in the South African context. And I personally, my favorite is Cabernet Franc and Chardonnay. And I think there's just still so much scope for even those 2 cultivars. And Cabernet Sauvignon, you can never leave that one untouched. The soils that we have in Stellenbosch and the areas surrounding it is phenomenal. And we make an amazing Cabernet Sauvignon throughout South Africa because of our ocean influences and the day-night temperature profiling. So even in the warmer areas, we're still producing really good Cabernet Sauvignon. And why I even mention these different cultivars is because our topography is so unique in the Western Cape that we have very little breezes that come over koppies and bring a cooling effect in an area that you'd expect to be really hot, and a sea breeze effect that blows through into the upper parts of mountains that would generally be too hot to produce anything. What we've developed in Terraclim is really applicable to any other country in the world, and we're excited to take this product and expand it further to understand Spanish cultivars and could some be fitted to South Africa, because then that becomes a global climate change scenario that we start really knowing what should be planted where based on where it really works.
As a Cabernet Franc fan, you'll be glad to know that the plantings of Cabernet Franc have increased by roughly 300% over the last couple of decades. So you just have to find some ideal little plots and then convince farmers to plant more. And then we'll all be smiling.
Absolutely. But then also don't understate the clone of Cabernet Franc. We had a scenario where on a specific mountain range, there were 2 Cabernet Franc sites, and the growers couldn't understand why was one doing so well and the other not. The climate profile was similar. And that's where Terraclim did all the analysis. We're like, there's so much similarity here. There's something else wrong. And then it landed on clone. So it's also understanding it's not just a cultivar. It's also a rootstock. It's also a clone. And that's what I'm excited about, aggregating the data for the South African wine industry so we can get to that place where we have real insights and all the data is lying in different pockets. So hopefully in the next 3 years, we can really start getting amazing answers.
That is a fascinating little anecdote that in the absence of an observation, you're able to make a concrete conclusion about another factor. That's incredible that you can say, listen, with the knowledge that we have, they should be performing the same. Therefore, it must be something else. Like that process of deduction is very exciting.
Absolutely. It's so cool.
Tara, I want to thank you for giving your time. What I think you guys are doing is fascinating. I would love to talk more about your top 10 Chenin findings and just drill down into that, but I know that it can't happen now. So thank you again for being so generous with your time.
Absolutely. And thank you for the opportunity. It was really cool chatting to you, and look forward to future conversations.
We've reached the end of another episode of the ViniMark podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing to the ViniMark channel so that you can join us for more conversations around wine commerce, wine science, cellar mastery, marketing, and the rising trends amidst the industry's more adventurous pioneers.